it's been a bit of a shock. However much one tries to prepare oneself for something like this, it's still a dreadful shock, and we're still trying to come to terms with that, and it's very, very sad.
It was a shock that no amount of royal preparation could truly soften. Prince Edward, standing before a room that suddenly felt suffocatingly small, did not raise his voice, yet the weight of his words created a sound like a crumbling foundation. With one carefully measured confirmation, a long-hidden, private royal crisis transformed instantly into a full-scale succession earthquake. The Duke of Edinburgh, a man known for his discretion and calm, found himself holding the wreckage of a family structure that many believed was untouchable. He acknowledged with a cold, clinical precision that the status of Prince Harry, alongside his children Archie and Lilibet, had been fundamentally altered within the active line of succession. This was not merely an administrative change. It was a tectonic shift that pushed Edward and his own family members dramatically closer to the crown, a position neither he nor his family had ever sought. The atmosphere in the room was not one of triumph, but profound, unsettling silence. Those closest to Edward were stunned, not just by the news itself, but by the undeniable implication that this decision had been settled in the shadows long before the public would ever know. Edward carried the burden of a decision he had not authored, yet one he could no longer escape. Senior officials had briefed him hours earlier. Every word in the document chosen to ensure no room for interpretation remained. The line of succession, that sacred, formal order determining who stands next to inherit the throne, was suddenly being treated as a flexible component of modern governance rather than a static decree of birth. Edward knew, with absolute certainty, that speaking those few sentences would change the trajectory of the monarchy forever. The confirmation was brutally specific. Harry, Archie, and Lilibet were no longer included in the active succession order. Simultaneously, the internal hierarchy shifted. Andrew, Beatrice, Eugenie, and Edward's own children were moved upward, closer to the mantle of power. For Edward, there was no satisfaction in this ascent. He felt the cold reality that the gain for his own lineage came solely through the irrevocable loss of his nephews. This knowledge tightened every pause in his speech, creating a heavy, uncomfortable rhythm. For years, Edward had dedicated his energy to navigating the fracture between King Charles and Prince Harry, attempting to act as a bridge across a widening canyon. Now, he found himself standing directly inside the gap, forced to announce the very event he had spent years trying to prevent. Moments later, the news reached King Charles. He received the confirmation, read the single page of text once, then read it a second time with a slow, deliberate intensity. He set the paper flat on the mahogany table, his hands resting on either side of the document, and for a long, agonizing minute, he remained completely silent. The king, as a monarch, understood why this change was deemed necessary for stability of the institution. However, the king as a father could not escape the visceral reality of what those missing names represented. Harry was not simply a constitutional variable. He was his son. Archie and Lilibet were not just distant heirs. They were his grandchildren. In that quiet room, the silence between Charles and his advisors carried more pain than any heated argument ever could. It was a sound of a legacy being redefined by necessity at the cost of personal connection. Edward then delivered the revelation that deepened the shock significantly. He revealed that he had been instructed to confirm a decision that had already been approved through a high-level, confidential crown process. He was not the architect. He was merely the messenger. But then, a second, sealed folder appeared on the desk. Edward refused to disclose its contents, stating only that the change involved a deeper, more complex question regarding eligibility, a question that hinted at far more difficult decisions lurking just below the surface. At that exact moment, Prince William was summoned to the room. Edward closed the primary folder with both hands and remained seated, while King Charles stared at the documents, refusing to look at his brother. The future king was being pulled into a decision that had the power to either resolve the current crisis or tear the family open permanently behind closed doors. The institution was moving, and there was no longer any turning back. The silence inside the room where William and Harry eventually met was not the empty silence of a vacant hall. It was a pressurized, suffocating weight. The kind that forms when two people who shared a childhood realize they are now speaking from opposite sides of an insurmountable wall. William had spent months avoiding this conversation. Not because he lacked the courage to confront the issue, but because he knew exactly what the confirmation would destroy. He had watched the succession review move from a theoretical, administrative concern into a concrete, irreversible reality before he had even agreed to meet his brother. He had debated with Catherine about how to frame a conversation that would permanently alter Harry's place in royal history. Catherine had noticed a change in him. He was no longer just a brother worried about a sibling, but a future king burdened by the reality that the institution he was destined to protect was now dismantling his own family ties. Edward's earlier revelation, documented in palace briefings, had surfaced a devastating truth. Harry had been warned months ago. The issue was never just about where he chose to live, or whether he appeared at public ribbon cuttings. Senior officials had raised fundamental questions about whether a person remaining within the succession structure could legally and ethically distance himself from the emergency responsibilities attached to it. These concerns had been communicated privately, with multiple opportunities for Harry to respond or reconcile, yet each attempt had been met with silence or indignation. When Catherine pressed William for the truth, he finally admitted that he had known about these warnings long before Edward was forced to step into the spotlight. He had carried that knowledge like a lead weight, afraid that any outreach on his part would be perceived not as brotherly concern, but as institutional pressure from the future king. Then, William made the move that would define the rest of their time together. He reached for his phone. Harry's old number, a contact that had once been the lifeline of his life, remained there, staring back at him. William stood beside the palace window, his thumb hovering over the call button, his expression a battleground of indecision. He wanted to reach out, to find the brother who had existed before the titles and the trauma, but he knew the moment the connection was made, the conversation would be shaped by the very documents currently sitting on the table. For several seconds, he was ready to make the call. He was ready to try once more. Then, with a slow, mechanical finality, he locked the screen and stepped away. He understood that the family had to return to the root of the crisis, the moment when Harry was given a final, impossible choice at Windsor Castle, and instead of accepting it, he walked away. The succession crisis did not start with a headline or an announcement. It began months earlier during a private gathering at Windsor. Harry had been presented with a demand that he considered an affront to his independence, while Charles viewed it as a necessary condition for remaining in the line of succession. No cameras captured the tension. No press release documented the fallout. But that single conversation inside Windsor Castle became the definitive point where reconciliation stopped being an emotional pursuit and became a strictly constitutional matter. Harry was offered a path back, a chance to maintain his standing. But the conditions attached to it required a level of availability and duty that Harry found entirely unacceptable. He had already spent months receiving correspondence about his status. The letters raised difficult questions about his life abroad and his distance from royal obligations during times of emergency. Charles had wanted an agreement that avoided touching the succession at all costs. He had even asked Edward to act as a mediator, believing his younger brother could speak calmly where emotions threatened to override logic. The king held on to the hope that compromise was still achievable. Harry, however, saw the situation through a completely different lens. He believed the palace was attempting to force submission, masking it as cooperation. This fundamental difference in perspective poisoned every exchange. King Charles saw a son who wished to hold on to the privileges of the institution, while rejecting the duties that defined them. Harry saw a father allowing the institution to dictate terms on a birthright he believed was his regardless of his lifestyle. The final breaking point arrived during that meeting. Charles placed a formal declaration before Harry, asking him to reaffirm his availability for constitutional duties. It was a simple document on paper, but for Harry, it was a trap. He read the final paragraph twice, his eyes hardening, and pushed the document back across the table. "I will not sign it," he said. The room went cold. Edward, standing quietly in the corner, watched as the last remnants of shared history seemed to evaporate. Harry rose from his chair, signaling that he would not allow his private life to be tied to conditions he viewed as retaliatory. King Charles replied that independence carried consequences, especially when constitutional status remained attached. Neither man raised his voice, but the restraint made the moment far more chilling than any shouting match. Harry left the room, leaving the unsigned declaration on the table, a silent, damning testament to a family that had finally, irrevocably broken. By morning, the story no longer belonged to the quiet corridors of Windsor or the private chambers of Buckingham Palace. It belonged to breakfast tables, television studios, crowds outside the iron gates, and newspaper stands across Britain. The quiet confirmation delivered by Prince Edward had exploded into the defining global narrative of the day, transforming a family tragedy into a massive public spectacle. Outside Buckingham Palace, the reaction was painfully concrete. A small, silent crowd gathered near the railings as newspaper vendors hoisted front pages dominated by three stark, unyielding words. "Harry out, Edward rises." One elderly woman read the bold headline, folded her newspaper with slow, deliberate care, and lowered it without speaking a word. Another passerby raised her smartphone to photograph the stand, capturing a moment where a complex royal future had been stripped down to a stark, emotional tabloid headline, while the deep human cost remained entirely invisible. Television studios buzzed with relentless analysis. Broadcasters repeatedly dissected the revised succession order, using high-tech graphics to display the formal ranking that determined who now stood closest to the throne. Pundits debated Edward's unexpected role as a messenger, with some commentators aggressively labeling him the primary beneficiary of his nephew's removal. Edward rejected that narrative immediately when he and Sophie watched the coverage from home. Sophie heard him state, with quiet frustration, that no one in their household considered another branch of the family being stripped of their status as a victory. Yet, the public debate raged on unchecked. Some royal enthusiasts argued that anyone remaining within the active succession must accept meaningful, unwavering constitutional responsibilities. Others insisted with equal passion that hereditary positions should never be altered or weaponized because of personal family conflict or divergent lifestyles. Edward understood both reactions, but he knew the television noise was stripping away the profound private pain behind every single name on that list. Meanwhile, King Charles sought refuge behind a closed door, attempting to escape the relentless media commentary. However, a passing broadcaster's voice bled to the walls, describing the historic decision as a king choosing the crown over his son. Charles reached for the remote with a heavy hand and switched off the television instantly. He did not shout at the screen, nor did he attempt to draft a public defense. He simply sat alone in the quiet room, surrounded by the shadows of a monarchy he had spent his entire life preparing to protect, knowing full well that no amount of constitutional reasoning could ever erase the painfully personal terms in which millions would remember this chapter. The final confirmation was released by the palace later that afternoon through a formal, documented statement. It officially declared that Harry had chosen not to activate the restoration pathway, the narrow, confidential mechanism designed to let him reconsider if he accepted renewed obligations. He would not sign the conditions required to regain his active succession status. The choice was now definitively his, just as it was theirs. Edward read the statement alongside Sophie, both of them acknowledging that the shift was now permanent, absolute, and woven into the legal fabric of the state. In the end, there was no triumphant winner to celebrate. Edward moved closer to the throne without ever desiring the loss of another man's branch. Prince William successfully protected the future structural integrity of the monarchy he was born to inherit, yet he was forced to watch his only brother step even further away into permanent alienation. King Charles secured the absolute clarity that his advisors and the Constitution demanded, but he paid for it with the quiet, crushing grief of a father. And Harry made the most personal choice of all, accepting the permanent loss of institutional standing rather than returning under conditions he believed would destroy his family's hard-won independence. The succession was undeniably clearer, but the family was forever fractured. As Edward looked out over quiet gardens, he accepted the new reality without celebration, knowing that the crown endured only because each man had finally been forced to pay the ultimate price for the life he had chosen.